Thanks, everyone. Thank you for inviting me and for having me here. I'm very interested in this project as part of a research effort I undertook, or I'm still undertaking, but last year I did some field work in Europe related to the COVID restrictions, and that was really an interesting lens to compare sort of border functionality and borderlands, and I saw a lot of parallels in borderland communities, but then obviously some big disconnects in how Europe and how the North American model kind of played out in restricted mobility across the border. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I'm going to start with just a brief snapshot of kind of the binational scale between the US and Canada. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about federal to federal relations, but just to kind of set the framework. And then I'll shift to looking a little bit more at what we do in Cascadia, and I will use the COVID-19 border restrictions kind of as a lens through which to compare how different approaches have impacted borderland communities and how we might move forward beyond the challenges that we've been facing recently. And I'll say that I live about 20 minutes from the Canada-US border. So it's not just sort of an academic exercise for me, it's also very much a lived experience of being somebody who navigates the border, not on a daily basis, but I wanted to start out by just pointing out that the Canada-US border is an incredibly long border. It's about 8,000 kilometers from end to end. Because it is the longest land border in the world, as many of you would guess, it's obviously not very homogeneous. It's connected in different ways, it functions in different ways, it looks very differently depending on where you are. We have vast swaths of wilderness, and then we have highly densely populated urban centers located adjacent to each other. But the challenge we face in borderland communities is even though the communities themselves are very diverse and geographies are very diverse, the border policy in North America is really a one-size-fits-all approach. And it's even further complicated by the fact that the US more or less has a model that what they do on the northern border with Canada, they want to replicate on the southern border with Mexico to the extent that that's possible. So in looking at this isn't sort of an exhaustive list by any means, but a little bit of an overview of how kind of the top-down binational framework functions between the US and Canada, I'd say we really have a goal of policy parallelism more than integration. And maybe that's where the North American model and the European model really diverge, is there isn't a striving for integration, I would say, in the North American context. It's really trying to produce as much symmetry as we can. And I decided for this presentation to kind of use the model developed by Manuel and Christian Lupret around coordination, cooperation, and collaboration, each being sort of a greater extent of working together. So coordination, if we're looking at kind of information and communications, I think Canada and the US have very strong networks of communication. We have very good, or we used to at least have very good agency-to-agency channels. So bureaucracies in the United States and Canada, they know how to talk to each other, they function very well, and they're pretty robust. And they're not necessarily subject to political turnover. We're not talking about the president and the prime minister. It's more the agencies and the bureaucracies underneath them, civil society. When it comes to cooperation, which would be kind of implementation, but again, in a model of parallelism, we do really well in regards to trade. We work together a lot on trade relations. But what's interesting to me is coming out of the last major trade negotiation between the US and Canada, the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, we came out of that with two different names, and then Mexico as a third. If you're Canadian, you call it CUSMA. If you're American, you call it USMA. And I think that gives you a little bit of a flavor for the parallelism occurring there rather than a real integration or integrated model. On regulatory cooperation, we also have a model where we sort of agree to disagree. So this might be related to food safety standards or kids' car seats is an example that's often used, where we have different standards in either country, but we say, okay, we'll accept your standards. That's good enough for us. So again, really sort of a model of parallelism. And then when we're looking at collaboration, which would be, I think, the ultimate goal of really shared common goals, working together, we actually do really well, both in our security relationship, which Christiane and others have written about, but also especially in regards to border policy. We have a perimeter approach to border policy that's been developed for a long time, for many decades. Some of you may have heard of the North American Aerospace Defense Fund, which was created way back in the 1950s. That was really a model of saying, okay, instead of monitoring our airspace between the US and Canada, we're going to create a perimeter outside of both of our countries. So that's a very collaborative approach, I think, to border security. And that has that same approach has progressed over the years to what we call trusted traveler and trader programs. Canada and the US have a very unique program called the Nexus program, where you actually interview with the US Customs and Border Protection Officer and a Canada Border Services officer in the same building at the same time. So really about as integrated and as collaborated as you could possibly be. And then pre-clearance is the final one I'll just mention. Again, these are just examples of a lot of other things that exist. Well, many of you have probably experienced pre-clearance. It exists at airports throughout the world where you go to board your flight for the US and you actually clear US Customs and Border Protection in the airport of your destination country. Canada and the US have been doing that for many, many years, and just over the last, I think it was 7 years, have started expanding that to marine and rail nodes as well. So in the Canadian-US relationship, you have US officers working more and more on Canadian soil, pre-clearing travelers, which is a pretty innovative approach to border security. But I will say that much of this work has been aided by federal, by national policy that have been strong in the past, but have ceased to exist since the Trump administration took over in 2016. So we have not had kind of a border policy framework between Canada and the US for quite some time. And I think that sort of set up a bit of the perfect storm going into the COVID restrictions. And I'll talk about that a bit more. So how did all of this kind of play out during the Canada-US border restrictions? I think coordination was certainly marginal. This was very much impacted by the Trump-Trudeau relationship. You had trade wars between our countries. You had really nasty words getting thrown back and forth. And this resulted in a huge lack of trust. And I think that lack of trust really broke down any sort of real coordination or collaboration that could have otherwise happened. Another very important component is there was a major hollowing out of the US bureaucracy during the Trump administration. So those agency-to-agency relationships that had really been strong for quite some time really fell apart because people in the US administration would just literally walked away and kind of hollowed out some of that capacity. I think cooperation was also weak. We were fairly aligned on the movement of cargo and trade. I think the same was true in the case of the Schengen zone and the European Union, where we pretty quickly agreed, let's move trucks and cargo and things that we consider to be essential. That was decided within, I think, a week. It was some record amount of time. That's a very different story when we look at how we defined non-essential, which gets down to the movement of people, right? We had very different definitions of what was considered essential and what was considered non-essential. We also had major inconsistencies between modes. Canada applied their restrictions to all modes. The US said, you can't get in your car and drive to the US for a non-essential reason, but you could get on an airplane and fly to Disney World and go on vacation. We had different testing requirements, different test types, different timing of when those test results were valid. And we also accepted different vaccinations. So for people living in borderland communities, as restrictions started to get eased, you can imagine how incredibly complicated it was for the average person to navigate those in both directions because they were so unaligned and so different. And finally, I would say collaboration really completely broke down. And we saw that in the way that Canada and the US eased their restrictions. Canada eased their restrictions months before the US followed suit. Canada developed an entire digital submission system called ArriveCan. The US had no sort of similar capacity, no similar program for border management. And we even saw coming out of COVID that Trusted Traveler program that I mentioned, it's like a flagship program for both countries, started to fray. And now in Canada, you cannot do your interview with both a US and Canadian officer at the same time. So I think that also shows how things can break down in times of crises, and then we continue to feel those reverberations and repercussions long after the crises end. So shifting a little bit to, how did this play out in the borderlands themselves? We saw a real hardening of borders that was prolonged in the North American context compared to the European Union. It was over a year that we had restrictions on non-essential travel. And it was only last month that the United States lifted their last pandemic era border restriction. So it's been 3 years, depending on how you cut the pie. It's been a very long time. I think there was very little awareness or recognition of the impacts of the border restrictions on border communities. We saw Canada do a little bit of this, where they looked at some very remote communities in Canada and they gave them a designation known as a trans-border community. But it was an incredibly limited kind of scope. And again, only 3 areas were able to take advantage of that trans-border designation to be able to move back and forth. And the policies were really completely divorced from borderland realities. Again, that idea that, well, you can fly to the US if you absolutely have to go. Well, if you live 20 miles north of the border and you try to imagine flying to the community on the other side, it's going to take you all day and a lot of money, and just like very completely an unfeasible way of doing things. And much like I think in the European case, we saw really severe social and economic repercussions. And in the US case, I'm not sure what is happening in Europe now, but in the US, we still see communities on the border that are struggling to recover. Our cross-border volumes are about 30% lower than they were before the pandemic. So we still have ways to go to try to get back to where we were, if we ever get back there going forward. And I think maybe the most important part is, in the European Union, we see a revisiting of policies and institutions and really like a strong recognition that there should be deeper collaboration. We should do things better the next time. And Canada and the US feel like are really going in sort of the opposite direction and going more and more down a road of policy parallelism, particularly when it comes to the border. There is no joint commission happening between Canada and the US to say, what are the lessons learned about these border restrictions? Each country is sort of doing their own, but they're not talking to each other. So that's very unfortunate. But shifting now to looking a little bit more at place-based governance and how we do things here on the ground in Cascadia. I'll get a little more into sort of more details and examples in my panel talk tomorrow, but I just wanted to give a little bit of kind of an introduction. And so my real challenge today is to sum up the situation of Point Roberts in one slide, because this is a very complicated situation, but I wanted to use it as an example of how cross-border governance is working in the times of crisis. So some of you may have heard of Point Roberts, even though you're from Europe, because it was sort of an international media sensation story for a while. So there's this little bit of land there in yellow called Point Roberts. It's cut off by the US-Canada border. The historic lore is that the map makers had no idea it was there, and they just drew the line, but then they went south around Vancouver Island so that Victoria would be in Canada and not in the United States. I'm not sure how true that is, but it is certainly a community that is cut off from the rest of the United States. About 1,200 residents that live there. A lot of them are dual citizens. And so if they want to go to Washington State, which is what Point Roberts is a part of Washington State, they have to cross the border into Canada, drive through, cross the border back into the US. So people who work on the US mainland and then go home cross the border 4 times in one day, which in Europe might not seem like a big deal, but it's a big deal here in North America. So during the border restrictions, Point Roberts residents were allowed to transit through Canada to reach the US for essential purposes. But the problem was, what's considered essential was really up to the officer in the booth at the time the person was crossing. So we heard a lot of stories from people there who might be going for a dentist appointment or a doctor's appointment, and the officer would say, well, is it an essential dentist appointment? Is it an essential medical appointment? And this kind of thing went on for over a year. So a very, very long time, a very difficult thing for these community members to navigate. So at the very inception of the border restrictions, we have very strong working relationships and channels of communication in the Cascadia region. And so that was really leveraged to kind of create this cross-border task force to try to keep conversations going, not just in Point Roberts. Point Roberts took up a lot of our time, but in the border regions in general. We met every other week for over a year, and this was community leaders, this was elected officials kind of at the municipal level, but then all the way up to the US Congress and the Canadian Parliament. There was health authorities, there were the border agencies, and it was really a way of just kind of fostering cohesion in places that were otherwise really divided by the fact that the border was closed to most travel. So we were able to really, I think, foster these vertical linkages. And this is sort of how I think about governance with borderland communities. Is you have the borderland communities on the ground, but then you have to sort of work vertically across different scales of government. And this was really important during the COVID restrictions because the decision makers around the border restrictions, just like in Europe, were in capital cities. And the capital cities were very far from border communities. And so it was really a mechanism for those of us who live in this region to be able to communicate all the way up as far as we were able to go to the decision makers and say, look, this policy is having this impact. Please think about some potential solution to alleviate some of these impacts. But then this group and this mechanism also was able to foster horizontal linkages across the border. So not just within their own scales of government, but also with each other. And again, that was sort of like a mayor on the ground saying, what's happening in your community? What are the economic impacts you're experiencing? And it was a very, I would say, a very functional way of dealing with a very challenging situation. And I think it illustrated how critical subnational scale is in times of crisis, and particularly for border communities, which are, literally and figuratively the margin of policymaking. So just a brief overview of kind of some of the initiatives that are focused on cross-border collaboration in this Cascadia region. I just put 3 up there that I think are the 3 strongest. The Cascadia Innovation Corridor, this is a group of representatives from that effort, including in the middle is the CEO of Microsoft. I think Catherine will talk about this more tomorrow, so I won't get too much into it, but this is an initiative that was really spurred by the Microsoft Corporation as they were expanding out of Seattle into Vancouver. So it sort of was started by the tech sector, but it's blossomed into much more of sort of creating a mega region and how do you create a cross-border region from a point of view of sustainability and transportation. But there's representatives from state and federal entities. And so again, it sort of bridges the vertical and the horizontal. On the left there, this is the organization that Hugh runs, who's out here at the table, the International Mobility and Trade Corridor Program. And I stole this slide from a PowerPoint he did, which just highlights the stakeholders at the border. The IMTC is the group. They do a lot of work on the ports of entry with the different transportation and security agencies. And it's a little hard to see, but there's a lot of different stakeholders involved at just one border crossing. So this is a forum to really keep these folks in continual communication. And then the other one is the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, which some of you may be familiar with. It's sort of often described as the gold standard in Canada-US relations. And this is a much larger effort than just Cascadia, but it brings together elected officials in states and provinces. And their sort of model is regional solutions to global challenges. And I guess I would say as well that having all of these organizations whose focus is on cross-border collaboration is very unique in the Canada-US environment. You don't see this in other regions. There's little bits and pieces here and there, but nowhere else along the Canada-US border is there such a strong focus and representation on doing cross-border collaboration. We also have a very complex mix of Coast Salish Indigenous nations. That's a very important thing to point out when we're talking about governance and multi-scale governance, because these are independent nations and many of them cross the border. I'm just going to read a quote from a Lummi tribal member who is not far from the community where Hugh and I live. And it says, "It's been put on us to bring an Indigenous framework to this Western way. Local governments, county governments, state governments, federal governments and agencies, we have to ensure that the framework of Indigenous traditional cultures are valued at the same level of science." And I would say that Indigenous nations, I think, again, especially in this region, have an increasingly strong voice at the table and an increasingly strong influence in the governance space in general. And I think this is something that will continue to evolve. So to kind of sum it up, I think Cascadia has a mix of really informal, dynamic, and multi-scale networks. And they are relatively strong subnational structures and organizations that are really built on a culture of collaboration and this sort of assumption that, yes, we want to work across the border, and it's in our best interest to do so, and it's fairly unquestioned. And I would say in other regions, again, across the Canada-US border, there's a little bit of a pushback to that assumption. These tend to be parapolitical entities that are really hybrid between state, civil society, and very importantly, the private sector as well. And then also Indigenous nations playing an increasingly influential role. And I think the success we see is really rooted in those robust ongoing relationships and those channels of communication. We saw in times of crisis, not just the COVID crisis, but that's a great example of one, those relationships for the most part held up. And we've also been really influential in advancing border policies. That Trusted Traveler program that I mentioned is a binational program that started right here at that Peace Arch crossing. But all of this, of course, comes up against a very formalized and hardened border regime. Unlike in the European Union, we have hard borders, we have hard border infrastructure, and that makes it a very challenging environment to do cross-border collaboration in. And so I think informal structures are vulnerable to political turnover, to lack of funding, and to major capacity constraints. And I would argue, I think functional linkages like trade and other functional linkages are just not really enough to advance structural integration, which really requires capital investment and legal frameworks, importantly. And I'm going to quote Emmanuel, not because he's in the room, but because I think what he said 10 years ago still holds true. There are networks of cooperation that mobilize actors to identify common grounds for policy cooperation, collaboration, and policy parallelism, but parallels do not meet. And I think that still largely holds true in the Cascadia space, but it's potentially starting to change. And so this is an example, again, Catherine may talk about this tomorrow, of an initiative of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor is this idea of, can we build North America's first high-speed rail system here in this corridor, connecting Portland, Oregon, all the way up to Vancouver, British Columbia? This remains to be seen if it will happen. They're in this phase right now of doing the governance study around what would it take from a governance and legal perspective to be able to, develop basically a new border crossing point and then align all of this between jurisdictions. But it's an effort at, I think, true integration and collaboration, and sort of maybe one of a few efforts at sort of true cross-border structural integration from the bottom up. I'm sure there's other examples, but this is the one that comes to mind most now. So in closing, what is sort of the future directions for cross-border multi-scale governance across the Canada-US border, not just here in this region? I think this probably holds true no matter where you are in the world. We're going to be facing increasing challenges that know no borders. The pandemic was one of those, but here we're seeing a lot more climate-induced environmental challenges. You may notice there's a little bit of smoke in the air. We get that on the US side of the border, even though the smoke's coming from Canada. How do we manage that together? Because it's in our best interest to do so. I think it's going to require innovative and adaptable models of governance. This is where we can potentially learn from the governance models coming out of Indigenous nations, which really do things in different ways than we tend to. And I would argue that the subnational scale is really where the Canada-US relationship is most functional, and the Cascadia region in particular is a leader in regards to that. So I'll close by comparing two peace monuments that I think is really neat, that we have a very similar way of recognizing cross-border peace. I was able to visit the Swedish-Norwegian border last year and was delighted to find a peace monument, which was not all that different from the Peace Arch monument we have just across the water. And I would say I think peace between neighboring countries has the greatest impact on borderland communities. And both in Europe and North America, governance emanating from those communities where there's a lived experience of the border is really where we are most likely to develop and advance solutions to the challenges that borders create. That's it for me. Thank you. Thanks.
You have been under 25 minutes, so that's perfect. Thank you very much for respecting also the time. I suggest that we first listen to Peyrony, and then we open the floor for questions.
Do you want to pull heads up on here?
Oh, it's very Yes, so I will. You not have an option. Several people may share the screen. I'll ask my editor to be 1 minute. I don't think she can keep looking. Maybe Vice President. No, wait a minute. Maybe if just to by waiting for are there any reactions maybe to the presentations, spontaneous reactions while we're waiting for the technologies? So, some questions.
You described the US-Canada border as a hard border. In some sense, as you were talking about, you agreed to disagree, and you said the child car seats as an example, where we agree to disagree. Standards are completely different, but we'll let well, let's say lower. I'm not saying whose standards are lower than anything else, but one side is basically bringing in lower standards. So to me, I mean, and I'm going back to, let's say, our own little discussion that we're having because of Brexit in terms of standards, and the EU being it wants to protect the single market. Therefore, standards are absolutely important. So in that sense, I say that is a harder border than the US-Canada border. You're letting goods come in on the lower standard.
Yeah, and I should clarify, I mean for the movement of people going back and forth. It's a very hard border.
It's not like your trade.
Not so much for trade. Yeah. Well, for things that are actually moving, but
thanks, Anthony, for stepping in. And I think we've solved that.
No.
Okay,
so
let's go on.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this great conference. Well, my presentation will be based on a study my organization made for the European Commission about the effects of COVID border closure on border regions. Tomorrow, my presentation will be more analytic, but today I will concentrate on policy lessons and policy development about these borders in the European context. First, of course, I have to remind you that in the European Union, the paradigm that is still alive and that comes from policies since Jacques Delors, President of the Commission between 1985 and 1995, is theoretically that the physical border is supposed to have disappeared. We have free movement, we have single market, we have the Schengen Agreement, which is about the free movement of the persons. But in March 2020, internal borders brutally closed. The states closed the borders and without coordination between themselves. And it means that the inhabitants of the border regions were affected as economic actors, and because the cross-border workers or consumers couldn't cross the border, but the mobility was closed or quite restricted. The inhabitants were affected as users of cross-border public services because they were the first to be interrupted. They were affected as citizens because suddenly they were only national citizens, and because restrictions were based on nationality, not on health criteria, at least at the beginning of the crisis. So it means that the supposed European citizenship was forgotten. The inhabitants were affected as informed individuals because suddenly the information was no longer available across the border. There was still information within each national state, but not across the border. The inhabitants were affected as individuals that are supposed to be inspired by their culture or their ethic, but suddenly the trust was broken, and the resident on the other side of the border was supposed to be a danger. And the last dimension which should appear but doesn't appear on the slide. I don't know why, because I can. Yes, no, sorry. Yes, okay. I didn't see. I don't see my sixth dimension, but let's leave like that. Individuals are also connected within couples or families, and again, suddenly, because of the closure of the border, sometimes the couples or the families were just cut off. Huh? And I will use these 6 dimensions as a sort of red thread during all what I will try to share with you. And what happened during this month or years of crisis? Suddenly, I mean, we know, all of us, because we work on this cross-border dimension, that borders are zones where persons live and not only lines, but suddenly, during this crisis, borders were only lines again. The cross-border interdependencies were no longer acknowledged by the states. Borders became, or it was clear that borders were also boundaries. I owe to Emmanuel this idea that on a border, states are back to back. And the problem is not only the fact that there is people across the border, but the point is that there is this sort of spontaneous movement that is inside each country. And suddenly we rediscover that states exercise a monopoly of violence, and this is classical political science, but also a monopoly of evidence and a monopoly of democracy. And borders that are supposed to protect citizens were suddenly again violent against strangers. And this lack of information, this secret, this ambivalence of the border, I propose that it's typical of these sacred institutions that are primitive institutions, and that somewhere the border controls are sort of ritual acts that are not necessarily efficient, that seem to be practiced and more in these times of crisis. So it's very strange, and this is where we suddenly rediscover that we have to overcome this paradigm of nation states that are supposed to be sovereigns on their territories that are defined by linear borders. And so I apologize to seem to be a little bit emphatic, but the point is that we really necessary to think the border, and because it's necessary to act differently. And so I think we need to be very concrete, but we also need to take a little bit of a distance and really to think why it's so difficult to cross the border. And this crisis has been an opportunity to realize that there is still really a problem with the way we understand the border and the way we manage the border. And so now I move to more concrete policy developments. So what has appeared as solutions that could be developed again to overcome the crisis? First, there is a need to acknowledge these cross-border regions. This is important, this vocabulary, because cross-border regions is in the treaty in the functioning of the European Union. So we have to stick to what is in this treaty. Yeah? And the crisis has demonstrated that these cross-border regions exist, in fact, because suddenly when it was a sort of counterfactual, and suddenly we realized that these cross-border regions were not considered by domestic policies, and in the future we need to take into account these persons with these 6 dimensions, that is to say economic agents, citizens, users of public services, but also individuals who are supposed to be informed, who are supposed to be inspired and relied, sometimes across the border. And if we have to take into account these persons in their cross-border living areas, these cross-border regions, it means that we need to build to help cross-border labor markets, cross-border democracy, cross-border public services, cross-border information, cross-border common history and common vision, and cross-border civil status. And because civil status typically is still encapsulated in nation states, and in fact, there is this reality of cross-border families or couples, and this needs certainly to work more in the cross-border area and at the European level about the acknowledgement of a cross-border civil status. And the second point is that we really need to progress through this multi-level governance we have in the European Union, because we have really, the local areas, the national areas, but we have also this European project, and it can help. Perhaps it didn't help enough, but certainly in the future we should progress in this regard. And what should be done? Certainly more accountability vis-à-vis the cross-border citizens, because the states lacked this accountability, and we certainly need to have a common accountability between the states, the regions, and the EU as a role to play. We need this diagonal coordination. And this new idea of diagonal coordination, it comes because the fact that we try to have horizontal coordination, vertical coordination, but because of the asymmetry, we need to have a sort of systemic approach, so diagonal. We need certainly to move from optional cooperation to compulsory collaboration. I like also this vocabulary coming from, again, you, Emmanuel, I think. And we probably need to have cross-border mandates for politicians and civil servants. There was no real cross-border mandate. I mean, when the crisis came, the elected people or the préfet in France, the representative of the national power in the regions, they had no mandate to act during the crisis. Some of them did it because they are inspired persons, I would say, and so they went beyond their mandate to recontact the persons they knew in the other side of the border. But there was no mandate. And I would like now to perhaps address a little bit things that already exist, and then I will move to perspectives in the future where we could improve this multi-level governance. And one of the already existing achievements is something that happened on the French-German border, which is the Aachen Treaty that was signed in 2019, so before the COVID. But it was, I would say, activated. These things take time, and so at the beginning of the crisis, the treaty was beginning to be implemented, and I think that the crisis really put a stress on this organization, and it delivered some results. In this treaty, there is a chapter dedicated to cross-border cooperation, which was not the case in the old Treaty of Reconciliation of 1963. And this chapter says two things. First, the states, so France and Germany, acknowledge that the local authorities and the cross-border Euro districts, that are the cross-border entities that exist all along the border. The treaty says these local organizations should have appropriate competencies, dedicated resources, and accelerated procedures to solve obstacles. And the second idea is the creation of a cross-border cooperation committee that has been organized just at the beginning of the crisis and that progressively delivered some results. And the originality of this committee is that there are all the levels. You have the Euro districts, the local cross-border entities. You have, of course, the big local, regional partners that are the three Länder in Germany, the Région Grand Est in France, the Département, Strasbourg as one of the European capitals. And of course, also the two states, Paris and Berlin, not only the Länder, and quite original, members of parliament, of federal parliament and national parliament. And this is quite important because it's multi-level and there is a sort of shared responsibility. And the parliamentarians, for instance, they are supposed to check that what the national governments do or commit to do is really happening. And this committee is in charge of coordinating observation, identifying priority projects, monitoring obstacles, and elaborate proposals to solve them, and so on and so on. And so it can be seen as a sort of first try and to move towards something that could be called a sort of cooperation 2.0. Because, of course, on this border, things have been happening since 50 or 60 years. You have already rather good integration, but it was not sufficient during the crisis. So we need to move more towards this integration. And this is where I will now try to give some European perspective to progress. I have to remind that in Europe we have this so-called ever closer union that is supposed to be an objective in the treaties. I don't say that it's always the reality in the hearts or in the actions of Europeans, but it's really in the treaty. We have a basis, as I told already, that are these cross-border regions supposed to be object of the territorial cohesion that is an object of the treaty. And so, and the treaty says cross-border regions, not border region. It is very strong, I would say. And we have, I will now address two draft legislations that are the draft regulations that are discussed now. As you know, the Commission has the initiative power, so they have produced two draft regulations, and they are now in the process to be approved or not by the Parliament and by the Council, the group of the member states. And I will shortly address the two of them because they would bring solutions. The first one is about a mechanism that would help to solve obstacles in cross-border regions through the adaptation of domestic legislation within a multi-level process. The second one is the revision of the Schengen Code. Schengen Code, as you know, is the regulation already implemented that is supposed to open the borders and that allows sometimes for states to control the borders again, but this power is limited, and it can be said that the states have been beyond what they should have done, and they made abuse with these border closures. So the Commission proposed a regulation so as in the future to have better monitoring of what the states do. And the first regulation is this mechanism against obstacles. There are two ideas in this mechanism. The first is to allow local stakeholders to propose solutions to overcome the obstacles they meet. And the second idea is to create a multi-level process to manage these proposals. And of course, the national decision can be yes or no, because there are still the sovereignty of states, but the decision should be explicit and taken with a reasonable delay. And there is also the idea that in each country there should be a coordination point at the level of the state to organize this multi-level process under the control of the European Commission. And so, very concrete, I take the example of this tramway. For those that would know Strasbourg, you have a system of tramway in Strasbourg, the city on the French side, and you have a city that is smaller in Germany. And the idea is that it would be great, but it's already implemented. But the idea was to have, as I showed in the second slide, the idea was to have a tramway the Strasbourg tramway and the French tramway going to Germany on one of the lines and for 2 or 3 kilometers. And this was possible, but it was necessary to make as if the French tramway was a German tramway, and because the legislation of the tramway is in Berlin, it's not in the and the norms are different, and so took much time and much money to adapt the tramway to the German legislation. So the idea in the future would be, why not accepting that the French tramway goes to the German territory, just in that case, not changing the German legislation on tramways. And this ECDM is supposed to facilitate that. And so, as I told, it's not still voted, but it's in the pipeline. The other legislation is this revision of the Schengen Code. So basically, most of the draft regulation is about external borders and secondary movements of migrants within EU. So I will not address that. But there is in the draft regulation 2 articles that say member states will have to notify, to define cross-border regions, I quote, and they will have to notify them to the Commission. And later, in the implementation of the Schengen regulation, the states will have to respect the rights of these cross-border regions. That means when they close the border, they are still allowed to sometimes close or limit the traffic because of security reasons and so on. But in the future, they should respect these cross-border regions, and the Commission will be able to check if they really respect it. So it means that there is a sort of top-down control of this management of the border. Well, this I will skip because I think it's a little bit theoretical. I will come back to it if we have time. So it means that basically, in Europe, we have this double scheme, which is the coexistence of fact of 2 systems of multi-level governance. On the left of the slide, we have the classical, I would say, multi-level government, which is the fact that in almost every country you have local authorities like municipalities, sometimes different levels. You have that are, for instance, regions, not in every country, but most countries, and you have central states that, of course, are supposed to have the competence of the competence. That's to say, they are sovereign states, and it still exists, and it will probably exist for decades or centuries. But it's clear that in Europe, something is happening that is different, that is complementary to that, and it's what can be called governance and not government. And we have these cross-border territories, these cross-border living areas. We have these cross-border regions. We have sometimes also the macro regions. What we call macro region in Europe is, for example, the Alpine space or the Baltic space, which is the countries around Baltic, and they are monitored now by the Commission and that tries to coordinate a little bit what happens there. And of course, you have Europe itself, which is with the EU, for instance, which is a sort of new sort of institution, because it's not a state, it's not a total state, it's an organization with variable geometry. The geometry of Schengen is not the geometry of the euro and the EU itself. And so the point is not to say that the second one will replace the first one. Both still exist. And so what we are trying to invent with, for instance, these 2 regulations that are in the pipeline is a way to combine the existence of these central states and local authorities, but to combine it with these new sorts of institutions that are these cross-border regions. I would say it's not obvious that it should be institutions. In fact, the Schengen regulation says you have to define these cross-border regions. They don't say these cross-border regions will have the government organized like this or that. But well, there is something new in the room, which is this cross-border region. Yes, perhaps I have. I take time to present this to present this slide. I think that we need to. I come again to I would say a little bit concepts, because I think that these new things require to understand where we come from. Cross-border regions, it's not that new, in fact. Denis de Rougemont, who was a Swiss thinker, very influential in the history of Europe. He made text, he made conferences, he participated to conferences that part Europe after the Second World War. This thinker, he dreamed about a Europe of regions, but of functional regions. And these functional regions could be cross-border. It means it was not in his mind a Europe of regions, ethnical, that would replace the states, that would be better than the states. It would be a variable geometric region. So it's very original concept. And I think I propose that it's linked to a conception of federalism that is sometimes called integral federalism or functional federalism that is different to the Hamilton one, not the American one, basically. That is the classical federalism. And the point is, these ideas come from, it's a little bit French theory, sorry, but it comes from Saint-Simon. The point is Saint-Simon was with Lafayette in the beginning of America, so came to Europe back with the idea that there should be a European, that there should be a United States of Europe, like that there is United States of America. It was end of the 18th century, so it's all like this. But this Saint-Simon had influence on Proudhon, perhaps you know Proudhon, which is an utopian socialist. And these people had an influence on the personalist, planist circles in Paris of the 30s, where there were Rougemont, Alexandre Marc, and these persons. They were searching a third way between capitalism and communism. And these persons were influential on Monet and Schumann. It's very clear that the people around Monet that proposed the CECA with the Human Declaration in 1950, they were inspired by these ideas. And so I think that there is perhaps part of the inspiration we could have now there. And we have certainly another story, which is the Anglo-Saxon literature, which is with this Hugenmark's theory of multi-level governance. That is a little bit this scheme. It is these two types of governance. And so I think that it's also useful in the future to have also theoretical ideas about these different sorts of federalism and how they could combine. And so I will now move to the last slide. What is important? Sorry. Too quick. Okay, so to sum up my presentation, I think what would be important is to acknowledge these cross-border regions and that they can identify the obstacles and solve them when they can, or put the problem at the upper level. National level should accept or not local solutions and adapt legislation and coordinate on each border. But if they don't accept, because sometimes it's difficult, they have to acknowledge and they have to say explicitly why they don't accept the solution in a reasonable time. We have different models, these bilateral treaties, sometimes these multilateral organizations that already exist, and Benelux existed before the European Union, and there is also the Nordic Council in the north of Europe. And this is a way, and even if there is no new EU regulation, we can progress in that direction. And the best way would be to have these regulations adopted at the European level, which means that in that case, the European Union and the Commission particularly would have a sort of new role, not of defining top-down solutions from Brussels to the border regions, but to facilitate this bottom-up process with a new role of coordination, of monitoring of information. And so that I will finish on that. So this perspective on new developments in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. We had two very distinct speakers. We do have enough time for question and for a debate. I think there's lots to talk about. The two examples show, I think, very well how different the Canadian-American case is from the European case. Maybe before, are there reactions also to the European case, and maybe also others to the first case from your side? You want to? Yeah.
Maybe I have a reaction, maybe also a question to you, Laurie. As a European, I'm a little bit naive, and I think when I look at the northern part of America, I don't have two states which have the same power, but it seems to me that one is much more powerful than the other one. So my question, and you talk about two parallel system of power decision. So my question is, how does the relation between the two states function? Is it made by a power relation, or is it more based on domination, or is it based on more or less balanced negotiation? And in fact, what is the margin maneuver of Canada?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. So that gives you an idea of the dependency of Canada on the United States. And so it's always the power imbalance economically. And then we're 330 million people in the United States. Canada has, I think, 35 million, somewhere in there. 40 now. But yeah, huge imbalance. But the border relationship is interesting because, I think it's always, not always, but it's often been in Canada's interest to have a more fluid border, partly for the reasons of all of that trade that depends on the United States border. More Canadians cross the border than Americans. I think it's around 60% of cross-border travelers are Canadian. Way more people are enrolled in the Trusted Traveler program in Canada than in the United States. So there's a real dependency that Canada has on the functioning of that border compared to the United States, which is much more focused on the southern border for political reasons, for trade reasons as well. Much more trade flows between Mexico and the United States than on the northern border. So there's definitely a power imbalance, and I think I don't want to generalize too much, but in terms of the border, at least, Canada has been a good partner. I think the United States-Canadian partnership has worked quite well because of Canada's interest in bringing innovation to the border to make it sort of function better. And then, the United States wanting to have a more secure border, particularly since 9/11. And so we've really sort of evolved through that fairly well, I think, as opposed to the U.S.-Mexico relationship, where those relationships just really don't exist. There's some collaboration, of course, but it's not to the same extent.
Thank you very much for both speakers. Yes, exactly the last point. Mexican border and the relations that don't exist. In the far away, very interesting, some months ago, appeared a book about COVID and border restrictions at the US-Mexican border. And what I learned and was really shocked that very many numbers were like fiction means in reality. US border policy didn't want to register Mexican people who cross the border because of economic issue, because yes, they work on the US outside of the border. What's your information? To me, Have you heard about it?
Is it cross-border workers?
Cross-border workers.
Yeah. So
yes.
Mexico.
The dark numbers, in order to have those workers on the US market. So.
Oh, you mean undocumented? Is that what you mean?
Yes, undocumented. Without border restrictions. Border restrictions were not used in order not to stop the border crossing.
Well, that wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know formally the U.S. had a policy not to allow asylum seekers to cross the border. That's sort of going in the opposite direction of what you're talking about. They didn't allow asylum claims to be made, the U.S.-Mexico or the U.S.-Canada border, for that matter. But it didn't really matter at the U.S.-Canada border. People tend to leave Canada to claim asylum in the United States. But I don't know about the undocumented situation. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of people that continue to move through that border and have been for decades, right? And certainly the United States relies on those workers. But I'd be a little bit surprised to admit that, given that we were turning away asylum seekers who, honestly, you can be claiming asylum but entering the U.S., trying to enter the U.S. as an economic migrant or as a migrant worker as well. So I didn't have to look at the book, but there was a lot of people turned away.
Other comments?
I have one for the European talk, but also some of the European on the move. One of the questions that has always, in a way, traveled is the reason why it seems that institutions can lead a process in Europe and why they cannot here. In North America, the way we look at this, right, is that we are supposed to basically listen very carefully to what markets need. And if the markets justify certain relations, right, and so, one of the papers that was cited in Birte in 2012, I wrote actually at Brown University, and the idea was to basically explain that what I find really surprising is that we create institutions to provide economies of scale to market forces and to networks of trade, right? And it can be regulatory and structures, it's a combination of both. In Europe, it's always, first of all, going beyond this, right? We are. The mechanisms that you presented in the slide, they show that you have a legal infrastructure almost now at every level of government, from the local to the top. You also show the history, which I think we can contest a little bit, but I like the idea of having to actually look into it carefully. Gary Marks and Mr. Koch, I know they work with this quite well. But these institutions, have always, in a way, answered broader questions, not just issues of trade or labor mobility or, these kind of pressures. And they're on the path, from what you told us, of becoming much more accountable to cross-border communities themselves. Right? So why is it that there is this major difference for you? How do you explain that it looks that way in Europe?
I would say that I cannot explain why something is not happening in America. But what I take from your question, but certainly other people have things to say. I think that from a European point of view, it's important that there are different institutions and probably the relation between these institutions is perhaps different in the way people think. But also it's different according to different states in Europe. But typically, I'm not a specialist of that, but it's clear that in America, Canada, US, as you say, market seems to be the primary way to integrate, and it's very market-oriented, I would say. The point is that in Europe, I don't say it happens, but there is certainly a European project where we are supposed to have this ever union, and this always this story about money. They started by the market, by industry, but money, as what is supposed to have said that if he had known, he would have started by the culture. Probably it never said that, but it clearly says that there is the idea in this European project that there is the market, there are functional things to build. Very soon, in 1915, the Treaty of Rome, there is the idea that there should be a European system of transport, but there is also the idea that there should be a political construction. And this came, and there is a parliament, there is a council, and so it's not only a market or technical thing, it's a political thing. And there is the idea that there should be something also with the culture and the inspiration, I would say, and vision, and so on. It doesn't mean that it happens, but there is certainly the idea that there is something missing and that we are in a movement where we should progress to more integration. Again, perhaps it's the contrary that happens, but at least there is a movement towards something.
Yes, but the issue with this is that the EU member states are much more integrated economically than Canada and Mexico by at least 15% of the gross economy. So how do you explain that? 63% of overall trade is done within the EU, and the rest of the world is only the West.
Just to follow on your question about how do these institutions sort of attain some influence that they don't seem to hear. In both presentations, there seem to be some aspects of this simple identity that come down to the COVID responses that you talked about. And so I guess, and I'll just so I haven't introduced myself, but I'm not an academic, and so I'm coming at this as very much a practitioner in the Cascadia regions. But it made me wonder, and it might be a very contemporary thing, but it seemed like, based on the examples you gave and some of the responses that are being proposed, there's obviously a capacity or a willingness of the residents of Europe to identify some level as a European, as well as a citizen of an individual country, where we might have NAFTA or now USMCA or CUTCA or whatever they are now. Sure, we have those trade agreements between the US, Canada, and Mexico, but not to expose myself as some sort of American that's not paying attention to anything else, but I don't feel like there's any analogous North American identity or potential for that would be the cultural element that might support an institution that would be granted some prerogative.
Which I think maybe the closest it gets is here.
Yeah.
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 I think thinking about North American trade agreements, and we think back to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which was the foundation to NAFTA, which is now the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, just depending on where you're putting. Importantly, in thinking about culture, the US and Canada had a long friendship of trust for over a century. And a lot of that had to do with a semi-shared history and also common military interests. And what started to happen in the 1980s, and it was actually the US's approach to Japan and Japanese imports, and especially Japanese cars, were starting to come into the US market in the early 1980s. And you had news features with US Congress people taking sledgehammers, it's just terrible, and slamming them and bashing them onto Hondas. And so what terrified the Canadians was, oh my gosh, if the Americans should run the numbers and realize we're not a foreign country, we're next. And so this was one of the first times that the Canadians actually said, you know what, we need to get this relationship out of the hands of Congress, US Congress, which is much more politically driven and more into a trade document. And that was the origins of the Canada-US trade agreement. And now, importantly, the Canadians wrote it. So a very interesting question about power relationships. Importantly, the U.S. as an entity, they're so busy with so many things. So in thinking about the U.S.-Canadian relationship, there is still a level of trust and friendship. And the Canadians, if you will, are kind of seen as the smart kids on the block. So a lot of times the U.S. government will say, okay, Canada, you write up what you want and give it to us. So for the most part, the Canadian diplomats, trade teams and whatnot are usually the brains behind a lot of these agreements. So the Canada-U.S. trade agreement was actually written by almost all Canadians. And so which is quite fascinating and interesting. And then from there, you then saw Mexico come on in the early 90s. But for the Canada-U.S. relationship in regards to trust and power, what they began to see in the early 80s was kind of a fraying of that 100-year plus relationship that was based on friendship. And so they actually wanted basically a trade, not necessarily legally, anything beyond the boundaries of the nation state is not necessarily legally binding, but it's an actual trade agreement where you have the systems of how to negotiate it if you have been treated unfairly and whatnot. And that was the beginning of this more professionally structured relationship between the two countries.
Wait, I have a question from the student.
Yeah,
from
okay.
the virtual, so I'm not taking.
Yeah.
So Maya Kanger, you have the floor. Please take it.
Hi, yeah. Hi, Laurie. I've got a little question for you. I'm not a political scientist or anything, and so like the policy and literature of this topic is a bit out of my wheelhouse. I'm kind of coming at it from an anthropological perspective. I found your talk super interesting, though. I read a really cool article in a class last year about kind of people who transit on the daily across the US-Mexico border to work and see family, shop, and live their lives. So I've got a few questions that are semi-related, but I'd love to hear you answer whatever piques your interest. Do you see similar circumstances across our border here at US-Canada, and to what kind of level? What are the kinds of concrete changes we can make to policy to kind of loosen these borders, as I think you put it, to ease the movement and livelihood for these groups? And do you think this should be treated as a priority in the literature? Is it treated as a priority in the literature, whether this is across the US-Mexico border or the US-Canada one?
Well, that's a good question. So I'm not a political scientist either, Maya. I'm a geographer, so I'm right there with I think, as I kind of said in the beginning, Canada-U.S. regions function really differently, and I think it's really important to recognize that because, if we get back to trade flows, so I talked a little bit about Trusted Traveler. We have a Trusted Trader program, which is very similar. The idea that you kind of get vetted and you get expedited passage through the border. Well, that was developed in the Detroit-Windsor corridor, really around the idea that you have a manufacturer who makes cars or trucks, and they're delivering the same parts to the same recipient across the border. And so it's really easy to clear that truck and give it expedited processing. Well, out here in the Cascadia region, we don't have a sort of supply chain related to automobile manufacturing. We don't have the same goods moving back and forth between like General Motors and these huge companies. We have a lot of agricultural goods. We have mixed loads coming from Asia. And so basically the way we move trade here can't really be very functional under the kind of program that the US-Canada created, which was tailored to one region, but doesn't work for another. And in terms of the people flow, it's a little bit true as well. Like if you look at Detroit-Windsor, a lot more people cross for work. You have a lot of nurses that live on one side of the border that cross to work on the other side. Here in the Cascadia region, not so much. Hugh and I have done studies at the border where a very small number of people are crossing as a kind of work commuter. It's mostly discretionary travel, shopping, see family and friends. So those flows are different. Now, trying to make the case in the North American framework that there should be exceptions for different regions is really difficult. They came up during COVID, where couldn't we have some sort of travel bubbles, maybe between BC and Washington, where the infection rates were the same. I went nowhere. There was really no appetite to make any sort of exceptions for certain areas of the border. So your question around concrete changes to improve mobility, there's a lot of things that could be done. The work that Hugh does here is really focused a lot on that, on making the border work better. We have some really good programs that are underutilized that could be advanced. A lot of it comes down to educating travelers too around what's required to cross back and forth across the border. And then, I mean, a real simple one is just we need a new border policy accord at the federal scale, because another challenge is if you don't have the federal agreement, then all those agencies underneath who used to work together really well, they don't really have the direction or the capacity to say, yes, we should be reaching across the border to our Canadian counterparts and we should be working on this policy, because there is no policy. I mean, there's some, but there's not a border policy accord at the federal scale. So I think that would be a priority if I could list one.
Yeah, no, makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Very interesting, thank you. And I think this concept of trust is something we could use in the comparison of European borders and US-Canadian borders, because in the European border region spectrum, in my opinion, we don't have this concept of trust. Doesn't matter at which border we look at. Yes. First, when I started to compare Eastern European border regions with Western European border regions, Northern European border regions, I thought it's only the problem of Central Eastern European borders. But later on, I saw no, there's no trust in Danish-German relations. French-German, you can say better than me, but I can discover problems in the whole spectrum. So this concept of trust, very important. But then, apparently, we can see then if crises appear, what can happen? That the trust can change, yes, and the trust towards the neighbor can become stronger than the trust towards the own government. It was the case during COVID-19 crisis in Poland. Because the German government supported Polish commuters, mostly nurses, and this is a very interesting issue, more than the Polish government. And so Polish people, inhabitants of the border region, started to trust more German government and politicians than their own government and politicians. And here we can see this concept of trust and how useful the cooperation is, how useful migrants and cross-border migrants are. And this nurses, is it a broad phenomenon in this border? You mentioned medical staff and nurses. Yes?
Is it a what phenomenon?
It's typical for this border region.
That area, yeah. Thousands of nurses cross every day.
It's the case in very, very many European border regions.
And they crossed pretty functionally, I think, during the border restrictions because they were considered essential, so they were able to go back and forth.
That's interesting.
But I do think the trust, I mean, we don't have to talk about COVID forever, but I really believe that if the US and Canada had gone into the pandemic in an actual functional relationship between our two countries, I don't think that the restrictions would have played out the way that they did. Maybe in the very beginning, but I think we would have found solutions together much sooner than we did, which took 1.5 years. And even then, it wasn't together. It was completely separate. So I think that the trust really caused a lot of harm and damage to how we were able to, manage our borders, which they divided.
I would go back to the question of Emmanuel, why do we have these differences? I think that's one of the answers, if I look at from the internal market law, is that the question of trust was not a question. And the question of why do we have to cross the border was not a question. At the beginning of the project of the internal market, the idea was that trust was based on common values because we were Europeans. Trust existed; it was not a question. It begins to become a question because of the different crises. But in internal market law, the idea is that you are confident in other member states. You trust your neighbors because they are European. and you don't trust them because they are not part of this integration process. And the second question is for internal market law. The question is not that the question is not why do you have to cross the border? The question is that you have to cross the border if you want to have an internal market. And the third point is that the European integration was a question of lawyers, because the idea was how can you convince states, sovereign states, to cooperate? And the only answer was you had to create a specific branch of law, which is not international law, not constitutional law, because it was not efficient enough to prohibit the Second World War and to prohibit crime against humanity and genocide. So the idea was that, at least for the people convinced by this European integration idea, I think that the idea was that states were inefficient. So you can't trust state. You have to trust something above state. And the only possibility was to create these specific legal links between states. Because that's always the problem, the discussions we had on what is efficient. Do you need to have something like the Council of Europe with all the institutions and very broad objectives and so on and so forth? Or do you need something else, which is the European Union, which is a space of common law, common rules, common standards to allow for free movement of persons, capitals, of services, and of goods. And this idea prevailed within the European Union, which means that you cross the border because you have to make the internal market. So the border is not going to be a problem. The border is just, it exists because it's a question of history, it's a question of evolution of different member states. But you cross border because you need to build this internal market. And I think that's one explanation of these differences you can have between Canada and the United States, is that you have to cross the border for a certain number of specific purposes. For example, to enhance trade.
Wait a minute, may I just react? Because and then I don't know, because I'm looking at this as a historian of specialized in European integration. I've got a different view on this, because I think with your remarks about trade relations and trust and friendship and the difference between economic and these personal friendship relations to America and Canada, I would actually claim that it's the opposite in Europe. I think it's the opposite. We have the internal market. We have built up European integration on a functionalist, that's strongly functionalist method. Trade relations, because they are not conflictual, easy. We've taken away all the borders. We don't have them. There are no customs borders. And so the trade is not, and we have to cross the borders. Trade is not a problem. The problem is the friendship. We had no friendship in Europe after 1945. There was no trust between the Europeans. There was only mistrust, and there was and they were all enemies, so you had to build up the trust, and that was difficult. And so and I think this is also because we have these differences. We are always looking at these multi-level governments. There are also these public things, these local authorities, not the networks. It's all has to be put into a framework, into an institutional framework, in order to make it easier for the trust to be maintained, for it to be built up. And I don't agree with Katarzyna fully either, because she's looking at Polish-German border, Franco-German border. During COVID was completely opposite, because we had the ressentiment, and all of a sudden all this reconciliation was completely erased, and we had the resentment again between French and Germans. So this is maybe a really complete difference. So we had this friendship, and then let's move it to the trade relations better, because we have no problems with our neighbors, and borders. You look at the border; it's not nothing. We have so many borders in Europe and so many conflictual situations. I'm sure that Anthony will follow up on this. That we have really a problem with these relationships. That's my opinion.
Okay, following on exactly from that, because as you're saying about trust, you referred right at the beginning on law. Because we have the ultimate way of enforcing trust is the corporate justice of the European Union. That it's all written into law. So yes, we can trust each other, but we can also, if you infringe the rules in terms of the single market rules, then I can take you to the corporate justice. So that's your ultimate insurance policy in terms of. So it's not just built on, to use a colloquial, lovey-dovey. We have, at the end of the day, we have the corporate justice of the European Union that is there to enforce the laws that are being established. So it is about trade, it's about the functionality around trade and building trust through that, but ultimately there is a corporate justice of the European Union there, which is there to enforce the laws. And the other thing is, going back to the European cross-border mechanism, great idea, but we were approached recently because the European Parliament are preparing something on it, because they're waiting they're basically asking the Commission, where is this? Because it hasn't gone anywhere, because member states are refusing to sign up on the European cross-border mechanism. So it's not, there is resistance within member states, and it goes back to, I think again, it's a lack of trust in defining what is a cross-border territory. States hate. They like this line between their states. They don't want to create another line kind of that links together a cross-border territory. They don't like that. They don't want the application.
I just want to give an example to the root, especially for the North Americans. If you look at the country of Romania, for instance, and you look at the NUTS 3 level, which is the EU defining the cross-border region, it divides Romania in two regions. That's it. So there are other countries where it's much smaller, like France or Germany or even smaller countries. But in some cases, it covers the entire country. And so this statistical unit that was created actually by the EU Statistical Office and that has been used for the distribution of funding is a wonderful tool for Romania to receive the money. But it undermines Romania when it's about, for instance, saying, okay, what is cross-border? The whole country is considered cross-border. But as a result of this, they've got access to all of the European social funds, all of the European regional funds, all of the Interact funds. It's like they pile up all the money together. So just, I think it's really important to realize this. Other countries, on the contrary, it's much smaller. It's like, the average is 40% of the territory of the EU, 40%. So you still have 60 completely outside, 37% of the population. But there are cases so I know Romania specifically because I think it's Nathalie Verchev in the EU who was making a reference to this the last time I had a meeting with her. She's an EU director. She's the director of a unit inside the Interact program, the two units that follow the Interact program. And she was saying, what do we do? We wanted to work with them on stats issues. And we will work with them on stats. But it creates a huge issue. So let's begin a picture.
A question for Laurie. All the discussions have been about trade relationships, but I think I only know the North American experience, a little bit about the European. But when you're looking at ecosystems, there seems to be a different mindset. I don't know if it's because you're working with biologists and that kind of a group, but the Puget Sound, Gulf of Georgia, the Gulf of Maine Council on the Marine Environment, all of the watershed under the IJC.
Yep.
And in Europe too, there are various regions where there's cooperation around a lake that crosses borders and stuff. So I just
and
wondered something to learn from that.
it's a really good example of how, and I didn't address it in my talk today. I have a little bit about it tomorrow. We do have institutions that govern certain cross-border spaces between the U.S. and Canada that have been around for a long time that function pretty well. Why I think that part of that is just a recognition. A lot of that is water, right? So if there isn't a line, I mean, you could draw a boundary between it, but it's meaningless. Here we have the Salish Sea, which was only named, 12, 15 years ago. It used to be, some people don't refer to it as a common area. The George Basin, the Puget Sound, Strait of Juan de Fuca, 3 different names of a water body that now have a common name, which is really important when you talk about trust and shared identity and tackling a problem together. It has one common name on both sides of the border. So, I mean, it's a little roundabout to say that, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, we have pretty good cross-border relations on a lot of water issues. I think those are less political sometimes. You're not talking about economics. You're not talking about immigration. You're talking about environmental health, which maybe that sounds funny to say less political, but it's easier to say, yeah, this is something we need to do. We need to get the invasive species out of this lake. We need to save the salmon here. People can really rally behind that, especially at civil society level. So I think you get a lot of buy-in from civil society for those kinds of efforts as well, which help to build trust in communities. Right.
Okay, any more questions? Yes.
Maybe follow up the idea of individual. In fact, we have two types of process integration on regional level. North America one side and Europe on the other side. And apparently we have different types of driving forces on both sides. I am wondering, do other types of border regimes, cross-border regimes, exist on regional level in the world? In Africa, for example, or in Southern America, or in Asia. I think it would be interesting to make a comparison with other types of other regions of the world.
There's the Andean region that has a customs, like integrated customs program spanning 3 different countries. Somebody might be more familiar with that than I am, but at the START conference. No, and the Andean.
Oh, the Andean.
In South America. And they have sort of an integrated customs region where it's like free mobility of trucks and goods between them. Organizing doesn't make sense.
You have the West and East African also customs regions, which I've been trying to invite to work, but they're very small staff and it's very difficult to get them involved. But see, they're very functional, right? That's they have, when you look at what they do, you realize that they work almost like in North America. They take one function of government and they are a treaty that will just monitor that function. It's not wrong. It's not that the people realize what the EU does. The Europeans have been doing for years now, almost 2 generations. So that's very, very good. That's why I don't understand why it works in Europe and not elsewhere.
Okay, well, I think we are with that today. And thank you very much for the 2 speakers. Thank you very much for the debate and for the questions. I think we've already started well the conference and looking forward to tomorrow's debates.